Welcome to this Baha'i Blog interview. My name is Leyla Tavernaro-Haidarian, and I'm speaking with Gordon Kerr today about Abdu'l-Baha's visit in Scotland. Gordon, before we begin, can you briefly tell us a little bit about the personage of Abdu'l-Baha? Who was Abdu'l-Baha? In case anyone is listening who might be new to this.
The name Abdu'l-Baha literally means servant of Baha, and he was the eldest son of Baha'u'llah, the founder of the Baha'i Faith. And he has a fascinating life. I'm always moved by just his experience of being an exile and prisoner from the age of 8 until his late 60s. We often think of Nelson Mandela was in jail for 25 years, but Abdu'l-Baha was in prison for more than twice that length of time. And when he was released from prison, he was able to bring the message of his father to the West.
Beautiful. What was the message of his father?
Well, that we are now entering a time of fulfillment of all the great religions of the past, a time when the oneness of humanity will become firmly established, the basis of peace and justice. And perhaps the watchword for the Baha'i teaching is unity. The knowledge of the oneness of religion, the knowledge of the oneness of mankind. This is the gift of God to this enlightened age, in Abdu'l-Baha's words.
So when and why did Baha'u'llah's son Abdu'l-Baha come to Scotland?
Well, he visited Scotland as part of his Western tour. When he was released from prison, he initially went to Egypt, and then to Europe, and then the Americas, and then to Britain. And he visited Scotland as part of his visit to Great Britain. And it was the most northerly part of his Western tour. So we're very proud of that in Scotland. This is as far north as Abdu'l-Baha ever reached.
Wow, that's so beautiful. Can you tell us a little bit about Scotland and Edinburgh and describe what it was like perhaps at the time that Abdu'l-Baha visited from the Middle East?
Well, Abdu'l-Baha arrived in midwinter. He arrived at the end of the year. And one of the very first things that was done for him was to provide for his greater comfort. They rushed to the local store to buy him some woolen garments because he felt the cold very much. But he was a guest of some very important people in Edinburgh. The part of the literati and glitterati of Edinburgh society had invited Abdu'l-Baha to visit their city. And Edinburgh was regarded as one of the most beautiful cities, and still is, in Europe. And it was the center of the Scottish Enlightenment, and it's famous for its arts. Today it hosts the biggest arts festival in the world. And Abdu'l-Baha was much taken by the beauty of the city and commented much upon that.
Wow. What are some interesting stories about his time there, and maybe stories at the same time about some of the Baha'is and people that met him while he was there?
I think for me, one of the most interesting things is the fact that he was received by such important members of the society. Everywhere Abdu'l-Baha went in his Western travels, he was adored by people, especially by the poor, who he identified with very strongly. And but in Edinburgh, he was the guest of some of the most important people in the city. And his secretary, Lutf al-Hakim, a young Persian who accompanied him on the trip, referred to this visit as in two ways. He said, these are never to be forgotten days. And he said in all his tours of capitals in Europe and North America, nowhere did he receive such a warm welcome as he did from the people of Scotland. And he was almost treated like royalty, people cheering him in the street as he went down in a carriage, crowds of people gathering in the streets outside the meeting halls where he was talking. And part of this reason was that his visit didn't just happen, but people have been talking about his proposed visit for weeks in the press beforehand. So people were very excited, a bit like an important movie star or member of royalty coming to visit the city. People were very, very engaged with his visit. So that made it memorable in many ways. And he stayed a total of 5 days.
Are there any specific anecdotes that you can recall for us about his stay?
The invitation came from Mrs. White. She was the wife of the Reverend White, who had been moderator of the Church of Scotland, which is, a very high position in the church in Scotland. And he was the guest of the Whites, and he stayed at their home. And she had been on pilgrimage, one of the early Western groups of pilgrims. She had invited Abdu'l-Baha to visit the city. And so there are many stories regarding the places he visited and the people he met. So where to start? One of my favorites is he visited the Outlook Tower, which was still there today. You can visit it. This was an early experiment in social engineering. And Sir Patrick Geddes, who was one of the guests who invited Abdu'l-Baha, he was the chairman of the Outlook Tower Society. And it's one of these camera obscuras where you can see the entire city on a table and people moving around. Abdu'l-Baha was much taken by this. And the vision of the people who invited Abdu'l-Baha was to have a peaceful society, a well-ordered society, a just society, where the needs of all the citizens would be taken into consideration. And Abdu'l-Baha was very pleased with this and remarked upon it. Nearby is the main church in Edinburgh, St. Giles Cathedral. And Abdu'l-Baha was invited to see a performance. I mentioned this because you're from Vienna, you might appreciate the musical connection. He went to see an opera, the Handel's Messiah, performance of Handel's Messiah in St. Giles Cathedral. And when he entered the cathedral, everybody just stopped and turned to Abdu'l-Baha as he came in the back. And I think this is the only time that Abdu'l-Baha actually attended an operatic production. So that's another little arts-related story of Abdu'l-Baha. He visited many places, and he had a constant stream of visitors from students, from artists. He had his portrait painted when he was there. Unfortunately, we don't have a copy of that portrait. It disappeared. It was one of the few places where he had he sat for painting. But for me, the most important thing is just the warmth of the reception he received. The anticipation of his visit was very important. And even after he left, for weeks, you can see in the press, there was continued discussion about the significance of his visit. Another perhaps important thing to remember, you may be familiar with a small tablet called the 7 Candles of Unity. That following Abdu'l-Baha's visit to Edinburgh, he wrote to Jane White, Mrs. White, who'd invited him. And in that letter, he penned the 7 Candles of Unity. And one of those messages of the 7 Candles of Unity is unity of thought in world undertakings. And at the moment here in Scotland, we have COP26. We have all the nations of the world gathered together trying to find a solution to the climate crisis. And we see in action the efforts of humanity trying to take collective action. So this, in some senses, is a fulfillment of the promise of Abdu'l-Baha, this prophecy of peace and unity. So for me, as an Edinburgh Baha'i, someone from the city of Edinburgh, born in Edinburgh, I'm very proud to be associated with this tablet, which really lays out the 7 steps that humanity has to go through to achieve its true purpose, to build heaven on earth. And there's a wonderful book called The 7 Candles of Unity. If people are interested to know more about the story of Abdu'l-Baha in Edinburgh, they can refer to that.
Beautiful. This actually brings me pretty much to my last question, because you already spoke about the summit where everybody's getting together and speaking about the climate. Would you say that is among the many fruits of Abdu'l-Baha's visit, perhaps indirectly, directly? What are some of the fruits of his visit, and some takeaways that are still relevant today and are still felt by the people in Edinburgh and in Scotland?
Well, whether or not you're a religious person or interested in spiritual life, I think that Abdu'l-Baha's importance as a thinker and a writer is demonstrated by the fact that his teachings are even more relevant, even more current now than when he spoke them 100 years ago. So you could say in some ways he was a man ahead of his time. But he arrived in Edinburgh on the brink of war. This was 1913. And he addressed a number of themes. He addressed the need for peace, for consultation between the nations, and he warned of the terrors of war. Another big issue in those days was women's rights, the equality of men and women. So he spoke on these themes. But he urged us all to really embrace the truth that we are now members of the one tree. He visited the Theosophical Society, where there was attempts of people trying to bring the religions together. And he explained that in the past, there were people of the book and people not of the book. And this is always the nature of religion, the conflict between people of different faiths. But he would express this idea that we're all members of the one tree now, under the same shade. And it's important that we recognize this oneness and come together. So his social teachings were very visionary, still be implemented. But as we struggle and stumble towards a greater realization of our unity and oneness as a species, I think the teachings and example of Abdu'l-Baha perhaps become even more current. And the Scots are a hardy people and well known for their zeal in religion. But I was very moved to read the accounts by the journalists and the people who met Abdu'l-Baha on his visit, because they were very struck by his compassion, especially for the poor. And I think that they saw in Abdu'l-Baha a prophet of the new age, an age of unity. And he was not only an ambassador for peace, but he was an ambassador for humanity.
Powerful words. Thank you so much, Gordon Kerr. Is there anything I should have asked you that I didn't ask you, or any other ideas and stories that you would like to share?
I'm very interested in the arts. We started a little arts foundation in a way to commemorate Abdu'l-Baha's visit. As Lutful Hakim said, these are never to be forgotten days. So how can we preserve that memory? And because Edinburgh is a city of the arts, we sponsored various arts projects in his name. But Abdu'l-Baha was a very practical man too. He was interested in social impact. He was interested in results. So I think that for the future, the Baha'is of the world, they can come to Edinburgh and visit the places. And the place where Abdu'l-Baha stayed is in a beautiful part of the city. It's called Charlotte Square. And these are Georgian houses, and they're very much a millionaire type residence type of places now. And the Baha'is, of course, would love to have had the money to buy one of these places. But what happened was that the National Trust for Scotland decided to choose one of those buildings to preserve as it was 100 years ago. And they spent their millions preserving, guess what? The very house that Abdu'l-Baha stayed in. So today you can go there and visit Charlotte Square, where Abdu'l-Baha stayed, and there is a plaque in the room where he slept, where he stayed, and you can relive the experience and retrace the steps of Abdu'l-Baha in that city. So we welcome you to Edinburgh to come and follow in the footsteps of the Master.
That's so beautiful, and I think so significant to hear, this year specifically on the centenary of his passing. That's really such a beautiful story. Thank you so much, Gordon Kerr.
Thank you. Nice to talk to you.